Correct.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Put your name in the chat, introduce yourself, and tell us what you had for breakfast, or honestly, tell us anything interesting about what you are doing in your world related to this green buildings. So you've probably been here before, and if you haven't, welcome to the first time. This is the Grand Rapids 2030 District's Reaching for Zero Carbon series with the E.H.Zero project. E.H.Zero project right now is a combination of partnership between the City of Grand Rapids, the Urban Core Collective, and the Grand Rapids 2030 District. We have done a series of slides deep diving into what specifically could happen to help empower the built environment to achieve zero carbon. Your feedback is so important in this because we really want to know how you will be able to achieve it, and we want to be able to help you. So right now we're going to be talking about compliance pathways for carbon neutral buildings, zero code. We have Erin McDade here from Architecture 2030 and John Dalzell here from Boston to be able to join us. And with that combination, we want to thank our funders to be able to make this happen today. The Kresge Foundation and the Wiggy Foundation are crucial in the work that we're doing here. We cannot be more thankful for this. And mark your calendars for an in-person event. I know, crazy. It's going to be in 10 days with the Commercial Alliance for Realtors and the Builders Exchange of West Michigan. We're going to have a talk about how this can help the developer side of things and how this will be able to affect construction of the future. So do mark your calendars, and I'm sure that one of us can put the calendar in the chat for you to be able to see the event and register for it. We want to thank the visionary sponsors, the DTE, Consumers Energy, Eagle, Weggy, who support the Grand Rapids 2030 District. We cannot be more grateful for such. And lastly, if you have come to our events and you enjoy our presentations and networking with us, please consider becoming a member. We have a fantastic member benefits page and a package to be able to suit your needs. So if you're curious about learning more about being a member, connect with Wendy Berg, my coworker, wendy@usgbcwm.org. She's wonderful. And we'd love to have you join us if you aren't already a member. So the agenda today, we're going to have Erin McDade kick us off with what is zero code, and then followed up by John Dalzell from the Boston Decarbonization of how they are doing zero code and renewable energy procurement. Well, I don't want to take any more time. We're really excited to hear from you, Erin. So go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jillian. Let me get my screen shared up here. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to talk to you about the zero code today, although as we are wont to do at Architecture 2030, I'm going to start us out with a little bit of context setting about why this is so important. So many of you have perhaps seen the climate clock traveling around the world before. It gets displayed at critical events and conferences and other global gatherings. And so this is an image of it from Glasgow at COP26 last fall. And there's two pieces to it. And so we'll start with the red piece, which is kind of the scary piece. It's telling us at our current global emissions rate, how long we have until we cross the 1.5 degrees C threshold established by the Paris Climate Agreement. And so you can see that as of last fall, we had a little under 7 years, which is kind of alarming. And so what does that mean, that 7 years until we burn through our global carbon budget from a target setting perspective? So typically in 2020 and for the few years since then, we've been emitting about 40 gigatons of carbon a year globally. And many of us for a while have been talking about 2050 as a zero carbon deadline. And the IPCC's most recent reports have shown us that we have somewhere between 340 and 400 gigatons left of carbon that we can emit before we'll cross that 1.5 degree C threshold. So if we're talking about a 0 by 2050 deadline, even if we were to completely linearly reduce our carbon emissions starting in 2020 and this chart and go to 0 by 2050, you'll see that we still are emitting 600 gigatons of carbon. So we're almost doubling that carbon budget that we have. So a 0 by 2050 deadline is actually not going to get us where we need to go. So instead, what we are aiming for here is a 0 by 2040 deadline with about a 50 to 65% reduction within the next decade, and then getting us all the way down to 0 by 2040. And you can see that if we do this, we hit exactly on that target for 1.5 degrees C. Moral of the story, of course, is that the sooner we get to 0, the better, and 2050 is objectively too late. Now, the flip side of that climate clock is what they call the lifeline, and that is renewable energy. That is, making sure that we're meeting all of our energy demand for buildings, transportation, industry, et cetera, with clean electricity. And we can see from this that currently the world is getting about 12.2% of our energy from renewables. So we clearly have a lot of work to do, but also a lot of opportunity, right? And the fantastic news about renewable energy is that it has quickly become the cheapest source of energy to produce new globally. So I'm just going to quickly run through these prices, and these lines are showing the difference just in one decade. So we have gas, peaker is the most expensive, nuclear going down to solar thermal, coal, geothermal, gas combined cycle, and then finally the two cheapest sources of energy again globally, onshore wind and solar photovoltaic. And so despite that 12.2% of total global demand met by renewable energy, we've seen, because of those price drops and because of technology improvements, this exponential increase in the capacity of renewable energy globally. And we see no reason for this trend not to continue. But on the other hand, as we saw, we have to make sure that we're significantly accelerating this trend as fast as possible if we're going to have any hope of meeting our climate targets. And so that's in part why I'm here today to talk about the Zero Code, because the Zero Code is in large part about renewable energy generation. So what the Zero Code is an internationally applicable building code standard for zero carbon construction. And I will say that while it was originally designed for new construction applicability, it is actually applicable in certain capacities to existing buildings too. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's pretty exciting that this framework is in place for us to achieve decarbonization through renewable energy for new construction as well as existing buildings. And the way that the Zero Code addresses those emissions is requires all buildings to use carbon-free renewable energy. And it also ensures the addition of new renewable energy to electricity grids. So beyond the requirements that utilities already have in place to ramp up their renewable energy generation capacity, the Zero Code makes sure that there's additional capacity added beyond just what the utilities are already planning on doing. So when we're talking about zero carbon buildings, all zero carbon buildings, whether it's new construction or existing, are going to require the same 3 steps to achieve zero carbon. So the first one is the one we're probably all most familiar with, which is energy efficiency. And so from a new construction perspective, energy efficiency might mean meeting the latest model energy code, such as IECC 2021. I know you're working in Michigan on getting IECC 2021 adopted. And for an existing building, it would be doing an energy upgrade and improving the energy performance. Then the second piece, which again, we've all been talking about a lot, is the electrification piece. We can't be zero carbon if we're combusting fossil fuels on site. So using electric appliances in place of fossil fuel appliances. And then the third piece is this renewable energy piece. Once we've gotten the building as efficient as it can be, and we're making sure there's no fossil fuel combustion on site, the energy that we are consuming needs to come from a clean source. And so that is where the generation or procurement of renewable energy comes into play. And this is really the sweet spot of the Zero Code renewable energy framework. So from a designer perspective, if a policy were in place where zero code, where designers were required to meet the zero code, how does this work from them? It's actually not that complicated. It's set up to be pretty easy. So the first, following those 3 steps again, design an energy efficient building. And again, the zero code is compatible with many energy efficiency, any energy efficiency code that that a jurisdiction wants to use, but is in particular designed to be compatible with IECC 2021. So a designer would meet code, basic designer requirement anyway. Then we need to determine the renewable energy requirements of that building once it's met code. And the zero code framework offers 2 different pathways for doing that. There's a prescriptive pathway where the zero code framework comes with a default renewable energy table that tells you, based on your climate zone and your building type, how much renewable energy your building needs to generate and or produce on site. Or, of course, performance path, energy model, figure out how much renewable energy is needed. And then the next step is just to generate or procure the on-site renewable energy. And obviously that part in and of itself is somewhat of a challenge depending on the geographical and jurisdictional conditions. And so this step 3 of supporting designers in knowing what and how to procure that renewable energy is where the zero code framework is really set up to help policymakers to establish that part and make that part as simple as possible. So I'm going to talk about the resources now here that are really for policymakers and advocates around the zero code for establishing that renewable energy framework within your jurisdiction. So the first set of resources we have are what we are calling these zero code guide documents, and they're up on the website. I'll put the URL up in a second. We have a series of these that we have developed and a series that are still in development by the Zero Code National Team. The first one, what is the zero code, is just a high level, fairly short talking points memo about the key points of what the zero code is and what it can do. The second one is the pathways to zero code adoption, and I'm going to highlight this one in a second. But this is one that jurisdictions are finding incredibly valuable, especially at the beginning of this conversation, because despite the fact that we are typically used to regulating this kind of thing through a building or energy code process, there are actually a bunch of zero code pathway adoption pathways outside of the building and energy code process that jurisdictions can and have successfully utilized, including in Boston. And we'll get to hear about that in a little bit more detail from John in a couple of minutes. And then we also have a guide document on the economics of the zero code, looking at how it impacts costs and what the potential economic benefits for a jurisdiction of implementing a policy around the zero code framework would look like. And then finally, a similar guide document looking at health and equity and the benefits of the zero code from that perspective. And so all of these are online, all of these and more, I should say. There's a whole host of additional resources online at zerocode.org/resources. And like I said, I just want to kind of call out for a second here the pathways to the adoption, since this is the one that jurisdictions typically start with, other than the kind of high level, what is the zero code? And I won't go into detail on every single one, but you can see that there are both city and state pathways. And then even within the city pathways, there are options for if you are in a non-home rule state or you are in a home rule state. In Michigan, I know you are not home rule state. So you are not allowed to be more aggressive than your state. So there is a whole set of pathways here for implementing the zero code. And actually John's John will be talking about this one. So he's on that same pathway. So those are the kind of less technical resources around the zero code for policymakers and advocates, but there's actually a lot more that goes into the framework, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my not too long number of minutes left talking about, because I want to give you a taste of what's there, but not go into too much depth. But essentially, the process of creating a policy to regulate offsite procurement of renewable energy can be kind of complicated for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of different options for renewable energy procurement. There are a lot of different considerations, and not all renewable energy is created equal from different lenses. And so what the Zero Code framework has done, and most of it lives within this technical document, is do a lot of the work up front that a jurisdiction would need to do to figure out the best approach for regulating renewables. And so hopefully the jurisdictions are not starting from scratch when it comes to making these decisions. And so I'm going to talk about kind of the elements of that for a few minutes here. So within this technical support document, one of the first things that it covers is the general renewable procurement requirements. And so what this looks like are just kind of regardless of the type of renewable energy that's being procured, the general requirements that we would recommend a policy have in place. And so that includes that the procured renewable energy is in a legally binding contract with a duration of not less than 15 years. And that the RECs or other environmental attributes are assigned to the building project for the duration of the contract, as opposed to being free-floating in the market. There's some consideration about the types of generation that are considered best for renewable energy procurement, that are considered actually to create carbon-free, environmentally friendly energy. The requirement that it's located within the same or an integrated grid service area. And so essentially this is ensuring that additionality, that addition of renewable capacity is within the building's general service area. So it's actually supporting the grid that the building is drawing power from. And then this one's pretty clear, transparent accounting that clearly assigns the production to zero. And John will talk a little bit about how some of these implement from a real world policymaking perspective. And I will say that while these are general requirements, the Zero Code is designed to be plug and play. Everything's already in place. It can be just implemented as policy, especially if coupled with IECC 2021, but it's also super flexible. And so, if, for example, if located within the same service area becomes too much of a barrier for a jurisdiction for some reason, requirements can be shifted. So general requirements regardless of the type of procurement, but then a bulk of this document is an in-depth analysis of the actual types of offsite renewable energy procurement that are available to most jurisdictions, and that the jurisdiction is going to be choosing from to make either applicable to buildings within their jurisdiction or not. And I'll quickly list those. I'm not going to go into detail about each of them, but again, there's significant detail about each of them within this document. So it includes direct ownership, community renewables, more commonly known as community solar, power purchase agreements or virtual PPAs, renewable energy investment fund. This one is actually one that is unprecedented, except for perhaps what John will be talking about a little bit in Boston. We might get to call the first precedent of this. So it's kind of a new concept that the Architecture 2030 team developed in writing the Zero Code, and it's very similar to we see in a lot of jurisdictions if there are legally mandated affordable housing requirements for developers, and in lieu of building that affordable housing, a developer can pay into a fund that the city ostensibly then uses to build affordable housing elsewhere. A comparable approach can in theory be taken here, where in lieu of a building purchasing renewable energy, money can be put into a fund, and then in theory that fund would be used to power other clean energy projects. It could be used even to help finance overcome the upfront cost barrier of existing building electrification for low-income residents, as an example. We also have direct access to wholesale markets, and then green retail tariffs. And then finally, probably the one that most people are actually familiar with is unbundled RECs. Also the one that is probably the least effective type of offsite renewable energy for various reasons. And I'll go into the details of that a tiny bit in a second here. So there's those two general requirements, the type of procurement options that may be available. And then finally, probably the most important part, it's when you have those two, and that's great, but how are you going to decide within your jurisdiction what of those requirements are critical to meet your jurisdiction's political and social and economic and equity needs, and which might need to change. And then similarly, of the potential procurement options, is your jurisdiction going to say all of those are fine? And is your jurisdiction going to say, you know, we don't want to allow unbundled recs? And so there's a very specific methodology outlined within the technical support document, including a whole default example of this process of classifying and comparing each of the procurement options. And so this gets a tiny bit into the weeds, but I also think it's worth showing because it's pretty interesting to look at what this means. What are we even talking about when we're comparing? And so some of the classification criteria that we developed are these. So additionality, we've already talked about a little bit. Does it guarantee that there is actually new generation capacity being added to the grid? The long-term commitment, we talked about the recommended requirement of having contracts be at least 15 years so that buildings can't just opt out. The assignment to the building as opposed to free floating in the market, grid management capability, environmental impact, inspirational and educational value, incremental acquisition ability. Again, all of these are defined in more detail in the technical support document, the ability to have permanent financing. And so what Charles Ely, who is really the technical writer of the Zero Code, did is he took all of those procurement options that we already discussed and he classified them. And so what he considers class 1 are these. And the reason he's considering these class 1 is because these ones have a high probability of additionality, the highest probability. The transaction involves actual capacity acquisition, so actual ownership in some form of the new renewable energy generation capacity. The generation sources are 100% known. Then the second class, medium probability instead of high probability of additionality. Instead of the transaction involving capacity acquisition, in this case, the customers are simply purchasing the electricity, not the actual capacity. And then the third category is that unbundled RECs category, essentially all on its own, with largely a low probability of additionality. They are undervalued is a critical piece. Unbundled RECs are problematic for a lot of reasons. And one, they are very, very, very inexpensive, which can seem really good on the surface, but really is an indicator of their kind of lack of quality and all these other characteristics. But in some senses, none of this matters. This is just a framing to help jurisdictions understand what the dynamics of these are, and what they may want to allow or disallow to, again, meet those equity, political, economic goals of any specific jurisdiction. And the last piece of this classification is the Zero Code framework has these discount factors built into them, and that they are all compared to assuming that on-site solar is a 1. So if you go all the way back to say we're doing an energy model to figure out how much renewable energy a building needs to generate or procure, if we are considering on-site solar a 1, then it means if you need to procure in a UI of 50 of on-site solar, then that 1 is a 50. But for the discount factors, then we're reducing each of these a little bit in comparison, or for unbundled RECs a lot. So you would need to procure significantly more unbundled RECs to meet that demand of an EUI of 50 if we were. And again, the framework and the work for determining this is all built in to the framework. But what I will say, and I really wanted to highlight the procurement method and characteristics part more, is that despite all of the discount factor analysis, we have not actually seen any jurisdictions end up worrying about this discount factor piece. Most jurisdictions are just saying, we are just not even going to worry about that. We're going to count everything as a 1-to-1. We're going to assume everything is equal to on-site solar. And we are just going to eliminate some options from our playbook. So a lot of jurisdictions are just saying, we're not going to do a discount factor for unbundled RECs. We're just going to scratch it. We're not even going to allow unbundled RECs to be compliant with Zero Code. So, and I personally, and we at Architecture 2030 think that's completely fine as well. And it's just, it's good to have this back end information to understand the impact that these different procurement methods and the renewable energy as a whole is going to have in the jurisdiction. And so I'm going to end on really quickly talking about maybe the most simple and plug and play use of the Zero Code framework. And I already mentioned this. So the Zero Code is built into the newest version of IECC 2021 as Appendix CC, which is the Zero Energy Commercial Building Provisions Index. And so what that means is that if a jurisdiction adopts IECC 2021, they can adopt that appendix as well, either as optional or as mandatory. And if either way, optional, it would be incentivized, mandatory obviously would be required, would then be bringing that offsite procurement piece into the energy efficiency elements of the IECC as well. And so just kind of some key features of Appendix CC, again, especially since that's part of the conversation in Michigan. Optional, I talked about, if it's adopted, regardless of if it's optional or mandatory, there would be mandatory compliance with the 2021 IECC, and then the renewable energy requirements built in there if it's mandatory. Talked about this one, sets a minimum renewable energy requirement based either on a default table, which is in there, or energy modeling. Provides incentives for buildings to be designed to be more energy efficient than code requirements. The more energy efficient the building is, the less renewable energy it has to procure, and the more affordable that renewable energy is. So it incentivizes designers to find that balance point between energy efficiency and procurement. It encourages on-site renewable energy when feasible. This is largely through that lens of the discount factors. May be valuable to a jurisdiction, potentially not. Supports on-site renewable energy or off-site renewable energy procurement when necessary, obviously. And then establishes a consistent framework the local governments can modify. And so that's kind of largely the goal of the Zero Code framework in general, a plug and play framework that is also modifiable. And this last piece has become pretty critical because a lot of folks are concerned about trading efficiency requirements for renewable requirements and resulting in buildings that are not as efficient. And that is not the way that the Zero Code framework works. It will not reduce efficiency. In fact, like we talked about, incentivize increased efficiency. So all of that information and a ton more can be found on the website. But more interestingly and importantly, in my opinion, is to hear from an actual jurisdiction who went through a process of doing all this, doing the community development and the policy development and the political maneuvering to get policy implemented. And so I'm going to stop, and hopefully we have John available to talk about that part.
Thanks, Erin. Great presentation. I'm going to share my screen and I'll get us started on our presentation here. Gillian, will you let me know when it's up and visible?
It is. Great.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us to contribute to your conversation in Western Michigan. It's very much in line with what we are trying to do. And it's simply that what we do in Boston certainly is important to us, but if we can share our work and if we can inspire others to come up with their own solutions to mitigate climate change and reduce carbon emissions, that's how we're going to get to where we're going. So really a shout out to you all for organizing this work and these conversations, but also a shout out to all of you who are working in this area and who are paying attention to these opportunities and new ways of building buildings. So thank you, and you know, lots of encouragement to keep going. Oops. There we go. So I'm going to go through a few slides pretty quickly, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss things. I wanted to start our narrative though with acknowledging our prior mayor, Martin Walsh, who set Boston on a course to zero net carbon by 2050. And it's with that leadership and that vision that we were tasked with updating our green building policies. And fortunately, we already have fairly robust green building requirements for new development in Boston. The climate action plan that we maintain and update on a regular basis, pretty much in every 3-year cycle, has been our policy tool. So in that, we set specific tasks across city agencies. For the planning and development agency that manages zoning, our task was to update our existing zoning to include a zero net carbon emission performance standard. We wanted to do some other things that we thought we can do now too, which is lower the applicability threshold to 20,000 square feet. We currently require LEED certifiable for all new buildings in Boston, but wanted to update that to reflect what we see in practice, which is LEED Gold. And we embrace LEED. It's still a comprehensive indicator of sustainability. It brings in so much value, I have to say, but that the focus on carbon is part and parcel to that. Real important for all of this work is we have an existing building emission reduction ordinance, affectionately referred to as BERDO. We also updated this to a carbon performance standard. So for existing buildings, we have requirements that establish carbon emission limits for existing buildings. There's a range of limits depending on the building use, and the limits decline over time. It's scheduled out through 2050, where it reaches zero net carbon for all buildings. But we know existing buildings are, and in Boston especially, where they can easily be 100 and 150 years old, existing buildings present a lot of challenges. New buildings present a lot of opportunities. I'm not sure I can really say that, but that in our new building work, we have been able to focus on high performance much more readily. It's obviously a blank slate, and so we have open decision-making opportunities. Really important, though, is that we're not doing this alone. We're doing this in partnership with our building owner, design, and engineering community, our development community. And so we've been able to work in partnership and really learn from practices that are happening right in Boston. And so today, we have, by the way, we've yet to finalize our zoning. We're sort of 7/8 way through the process. We've drafted our zoning and recommendations and things like that. But more importantly, we've already been applying the framework and practices. And so on your right in this slide is Boston University new building. And they have been a partner to us in all of this. So they worked pretty hard on this building, but actually found that they didn't have to do that much work. And in fact, they didn't have to spend any more money. What they were able to achieve was a 53% reduction in energy use. And then very importantly, a 93% reduction in fossil fuel. I actually think that's wrong. I think this building is now 100% electric. BU already purchases all their electricity from a renewable resource. But just to be in line with our goals, they're actually adding on campus new solar renewable energy to fully electrify this building or meet its full electrification loads. We have other projects in the city as well across different housing typologies. And interestingly enough, I really want to give a big salute to our affordable housing development community. They've been at the forefront of practice. I think they really do understand the health benefits of green buildings, but they also understand the value of high performance buildings, and especially as it pertains to costs that are passed on to tenants and occupants. Bunker Hill Housing is a large redevelopment project. There are several buildings there, but without spending any additional money, they were able to design buildings that will achieve LEED Gold. They've cut the energy in half. I don't know if any of you are familiar with multifamily residential practices, but an energy use intensity of 19 is pretty remarkable. And I have to say, we're seeing projects beat that now. We've just signed off on a project with an EUI of 12, and it's not doing anything all that remarkable, just getting a little bit smarter about the synergies between strategies. The BUM building I mentioned, and now, oops, here we go, one more click here. And we also have, and especially right now, because life science building development is probably our predominant building type in the city of new construction. So we've recently signed off on a couple of life science buildings where they've been able to achieve 50% energy reductions, LEED Gold or better, and significant reductions in fossil fuel. They've also committed to 100% renewable electricity. So we're seeing great things out of our partners in the city and are able to move forward. Just as a little more background, we have advanced practices under current zoning and regulation. So as I said before, we typically see LEED Gold. We take a comprehensive approach to sustainability. And a few years ago, as we focused on zero net carbon, we introduced a requirement that buildings do a carbon neutral building assessment. This is a great way to start policy, by the way. It doesn't have any formal performance requirement to it. It is simply that we asked projects to assess additional strategies to reduce energy use, or in our case, because of our focus on carbon, to reduce carbon emissions. So that breaks down to focusing on the enclosure, the building systems, including on-site renewable energies and procuring renewable energy. And there is our framework. The most complicated part of this work, honestly, has been establishing carbon emission targets for buildings. And so what can we do without making it so hard that projects would leave our jurisdiction and build elsewhere? And so we've worked pretty hard with our development community. What we've found is across the boards, we can certainly do a lot better. The framework, again, renewable energy on site, and then renewable energy procurement. One of the really interesting things, though, that came up during our process was a strong interest in including embodied carbon. This wasn't part of our work plan. We were very focused on operational carbon emissions, but the stakeholders we were working with were quite adamant, well organized, and really well informed. And so, in fact, it turned out to be a really robust conversation. We had, I think, 4 or 5 meetings with hundreds of attendees weighing in on strategies for reducing embodied carbon. So our draft zoning anticipates future practices around embodied carbon reduction. What all of this framework measures out to be is again, a calculation that assesses how much carbon a building's emitting. We reduce that by on-site renewable energy. We identify a renewable energy procurement requirement. And then through our existing building disclosure ordinance, there's an annual reporting on compliance. And so for buildings subject to the new zoning, their limit would be 0, and they would be reporting annually on compliance. So we're able to put our 2 policy pieces together and come up with, I think, a pretty reasonable framework for advancing building practices. So let me dig into some of the details. I'll go quickly through this so we can talk about things. But first, I want to give a shout out to our partners here, Thornton Tomasetti and BR+A, that worked with our technical advisory group and stakeholders to design a process and conduct a conversation that was really quite technical, but also quite thorough. The recommendations we came up with do establish performance targets based on carbon emissions, but also importantly, the recommendation to stand up an advisory group to continue to review and update those targets. So what we found through a lot of analysis is that most buildings in Boston are able to reduce carbon emissions by about 40%. It's with effort, it's not easy, but it's doable. And so what we really wanted to settle on was both something achievable and meaningful. And so this 40% emission reduction target is right there. We know there are typologies in Boston that are much more energy intensive, hospitals, healthcare facilities with specific procedures, things like that, that aren't going to be able to achieve the 40%. And so we do allow 30% for some, just a few use typologies. We also recognize residential projects will use different standards like WFI models and HERS models and things like that. So we have pathways for those projects to comply. The other thing we wanted to do, though, is establish use-specific targets based on our carbon emission intensity. Here's where the world gets a little bit more complex because we now measure carbon in kilograms by square foot by year. And so we're introducing a new metric. It's appropriate for us because we are regulating carbon. And I think it's really important to keep an eye on what it is that you are trying to do. But what we found through a lot of analysis is that we could establish performance targets based on use typologies, and that those would be a much easier way to convey practice expectations to development teams. This chart I particularly like because for those of us who are familiar with building performance modeling, a lot of that practice does deliver an energy use intensity. And so you can kind of see a direct comparison of an EUI to these targets. I should say we're using 2035 grid emission factors in calculating the carbon emission intensity. We're doing this for a couple of reasons. It's to reflect the life cycle of the initial building equipment. So we don't want to just measure in today's terms because there's so much fossil fuel still in the utility mix of energy, but that these systems will be with us for 15, 20 years. So pushing it out 10 years to 2035 made a lot of sense. It also reflects improvements in the amount of renewable energy in our electric grid. And it biases practices toward electrification, which is part of our strategies for achieving carbon neutrality. So when we measure a building performance out in 2035, if it's relying on a lot of fossil fuel, in our case, it's principally natural gas, it's not going to perform that well over time. And so it's been an interesting strategy to keep people focused on best practices. So I'm so happy to be hosted by West Michigan chapter of the USGBC. In Boston, our USGBC chapter is the Built Environment Plus. They've been able to lead in a lot of communication analysis in the zero net carbon building space. And so there's two reports that we like to reference. The first is a few years old now, Saving Money from the Start. And it was a deep dive into Massachusetts buildings that were targeting zero net carbon. That was updated last year to a new report, Massachusetts is Ready for Net Zero. And again, collecting information on high performing projects in and around Massachusetts. And then importantly, starting to look at the costs associated with those projects. And what was remarkable and continues to be the story is there isn't an additional cost to building a net zero building. More often it has to do with trading different solutions out, looking for synergy. So, classic stuff. You do a better building enclosure, your mechanical systems get smaller, and you spend less on those kinds of solutions for achieving the building performance that you need. What we're also seeing as we move into these higher performance buildings, once you've reduced energy by 50%, you're really moving down through classes of mechanical systems, for instance. So now you've got a whole new set of solutions available to you, and you get some knock-on benefits. So easy is that you can do electric buildings. You don't need fossil fuels to, for instance, do an office building or multifamily residential building. That saves you a lot of infrastructure costs. It saves you a lot of costs on piping an explosive chemical through your building, by the way, but also interconnection costs with the utilities themselves. So it's really a strategy of trading off costs. And again, what we're finding in many instances is the costs are less than 1%. We're seeing instances where with the utility incentives for high performance, it's actually costing less to build a net zero building. And I think that'll be the narrative of the future. We are introducing standards for on-site renewable energy. And so we do see that for the many reasons that I think Erin indicated. And so we're hoping to see a lot more innovation in this space as well. So I'm showing the proposed GE headquarters building that had not been built. They scaled back their plans, but they started with a pretty visionary building with this incredible solar PV screen. When they did scale back, the development partner is building a building there, but they are not building it with this solar veil. They are, in fact, including more solar PV on the building. So it doesn't have to be a dramatic architectural expression to be a high performance on-site renewable solution. Renewable energy for us has lots of benefits, obvious emission reductions, grid management, but certainly local jobs and business, public health, and then resiliency. So real important benefits to be realized. We are following what I think are emerging as national practices. So we want to set expectations around building design to make sure that it's considered right from the beginning of the project. So let's make sure we intervene early on in project planning. We did want to define some minimum requirements, but also recognize that there are lots of instances where those requirements can't be met. Certainly when you're building tall buildings with a lot of mechanical equipment on the rooftop, those solutions become much more limited. But we also have historic districts and design overlay districts and other instances where it wouldn't necessarily make sense to or be possible to even achieve a 50% cover of a roof. I'll go quickly through renewable energy because I think Erin did a fantastic job both in presenting here, but also working with us. And so we do want to and have included strategies and standards for purchasing of renewable energy. We are making sure to align between our new building zoning and our existing building reporting. And we want to make sure through the permitting process that development teams and their stakeholders and partners are fully aware of what's expected of them once the buildings are occupied. So we do require these upfront calculations, even though the costs, if there are costs for renewable energy, don't show up until the buildings opens its doors. Really, Architecture 2030 deserves a big shout out here. Vince Martinez, Erin, and Charles Eli were fantastic experts and partners in working with the city and our stakeholders to establish renewable energy procurement standards. A lot of the work is familiar, as you would expect, doing background research, just making sure we're fully up to speed on everything locally as well as nationally. I have to say, one of the wonderful things that Architecture 2030 helped us with was establishing the values that were important for us. So these are, they're certainly familiar, but these are our values, right? And they reflect what's important to the city of Boston. And then using these kinds of values, we can arrive at solutions that work for us. And so focusing on Massachusetts Class 1 recs, we do have the ability to verify annually. So we're freed of worrying about the longevity of rec purchases and things like that. We can be much more market fluid in that projects could make shorter commitments based on what's available and even change those out over time as long as they continue to meet our requirements. And so our options ended up similar to what Erin presented, the one thing I really want to give a shout out to is we did not set a carbon offset for fossil fuel use. What we've created through our existing building ordinance is an alternative compliance payment that'll fund an equitable emissions investment fund. And this is a strategy to bring resources back to the city in the form of monies that can be invested in electrification of other buildings that might not have the financial resources, for instance, affordable housing, or investment in local renewable energy systems. It also stands as a straight add-on to fossil fuel use, so it does put additional financial pressure on those who want to use fossil fuel. So I think it serves us in a few different ways, and that's an important thing to recognize. Lastly, again, we touched on embodied carbon, and a really great group came together to advise us on that, including Architecture 2030. We have drafted our zoning so that it recognizes the carbon emissions from building material extraction, fabrication, and transportation. I think the moment we're in is much like the beginning of green buildings, where we could clearly see what is better, but not necessarily evaluate comparative strategies. And so that's okay, right? That's where we are today. We do include recommendations for things like LEED credits that advance our work in reducing embodied carbon by using materials that have environmental product declarations, doing life cycle analysis, things like that. And we are already seeing, low-hanging fruit solutions. And when you look at this work, you quickly realize embodied carbon is a significant part of our workspace. And as we get more and more successful with building operations and reducing carbon from building operations, what stands out is that big slug of carbon emissions from the upfront construction of buildings. And so what we've come to realize is, with a high performance building, in the first 10 years, 50% of the carbon emissions will be from embodied carbon from the construction of the building. And so it just, that's a prioritization. It certainly reflects high performance buildings, the use of renewable energy, but it tells us what really is next important in our carbon reduction journey. When you do look at the embodied carbon in buildings, a lot of it is in the structure. A lot of it comes from concrete and steel. So for our work, we've already started to pilot some practices, and that's an important thing when it's early on. So we've created a mass timber accelerator program. We clearly understand that swapping out steel and concrete for mass timber that's regionally harvested is a far lower carbon intensive means of building buildings. I think all of us can find various solutions like that. We do have some really interesting ones as well, like working at the municipal and state level to collaborate on standards for instance, low carbon concrete. How do we make sure our concrete batching plants can offer product to the private sector that reduces the carbon emissions? And so I think we can do that through our buying power, through what we specify in state and building contracts, but also through our leadership, just being right there, having the conversations and pursuing that kind of advocacy. So I will stop. I think that's my second to last slide up. Here we go. Boston University, once again, showing us the way. Without spending any additional money, they were able to reduce the embodied carbon in the structure and facade by 10%. So overall, 13% reduction. And again, no change in the building design, no added costs. It just reminds us what's possible when we put our minds to the work. Here's some information on me. And a lot of these buildings that I've featured are part of our climate resiliency case study. You can find more information there, and certainly a lot more on our website.
Thank you, John. Like I would ask people to do a round of applause right now because, well, clearly in the chat and the text I've been getting, this presentation is very impressive. Thank you, John, and thank you, Erin. If we about have maybe a minute for like 2 questions or so, and then we got to get going. Would you mind taking down your slides and showing your screen, Erin? Well, not your screen, your face. And if anybody wants to get a hold of you, just while we have the conversation going, because I'm sure that we're not going to be able to get all the questions. If you feel comfortable, would you put your contact information in the chat? So there seems to be like watching the dialogue been going through and the questions that we've seen in the chat. So it seems that this connection to getting the building owners and the clients and the developers to also be on the same train. It seems like there has been some critical conversations that have happened in Boston that have changed the narrative locally. Would you be able to speak to the critiques and then the responses to building such advanced buildings and procurement structures?
So on the building side of things, it has been an incremental journey. And I think this is where, our solutions might not be just right for other jurisdictions. I didn't say this at the beginning, but it's worth noting. Massachusetts has a state building code. Boston, as a large city, has a great deal of zoning authority. And so our framework and our approach through zoning makes a great deal of sense for us. We also have a pretty rigorous permitting process for large development in Boston. So buildings over 20,000 square feet go through a pretty robust review process. So those are, background pieces that are important to us, but I think everybody has their version of things and just simply should pursue where they're going to be most successful most quickly. And then recognize even our zero net carbon building zoning is a step along a much larger path. I think what we found is even with our existing regulations, we could pursue better buildings. And by having a really stated value like carbon neutral, development proponents come into the city and in many cases are speaking to us toward our values. So they're showing us that they care, they share those values. And they're proposing zero net carbon buildings without the force of a requirement. We can reflect that. We don't have an incentive in the building permit process where we can expedite projects. And this is terrible of me to joke, but we do have one incentive for doing better buildings, and it's called a building permit. And so we do all that. I think we all, with a great deal of responsibility and humility, conduct ourselves accordingly. But we can recognize that, right? And not everybody comes in and is enlightened as the projects I showed you, right? So I don't pick my customers. Everybody's entitled to a permit. Some do come in with really great projects across lots of measures and are quickly permitted, and others come in with not such good projects, and we spend a lot of time and effort leading to better buildings. But Gillian, the real thing here is we are building good buildings. These aren't extraordinary buildings. We are pushing our teams to do better buildings, and we find that we can achieve the performance levels that move us into a zero net carbon framework. And so that's the big takeaway. We can do this work today.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, John. And I know you do have a hard stop at 10. It is 10. If you have to go ahead. But there's a question, maybe Erin, you can also help answer. And by the way, folks, I know that the chat towards us and in the Q&A box has been going off. If you want to elevate your question again to the Q&A, please do. Thank you, Erin, for typing answers. John, with LEED Gold certification being required by code in Boston, are more LEED certifications being done by the AE firm in-house or by a sustainability consultant? How do you see the architecture engineering firm responding to this?
That's a really great question. I would say right now it's a blend of sustainability firms that are helping contribute to project team planning. And they do work across the traditional LEED framework. They are providing things like life cycle analysis services. Some are providing building performance modeling. But I'm also seeing building performance modeling firms edging into some of the sustainability workspace. What I don't see a lot of right now is architecture firms with in-house performance modeling.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect some of that will change, and that's partly our doing. We require early or preliminary building performance modeling. And so, you know, for many of you in architecture, you'll probably work really hard to design a good building. And then, you know, right at the end of the process, you'll reach out to your performance modeling firm and run a model for code compliance. And doesn't do a lot to help with decision making. So we really set to work on a framework that requires a much more integrated project planning process. And at the end of the day, as a regulator, it really distills down to things like, we're not seeing it, so let's just require a preliminary model, right? And we worked with our utilities. Our utilities will help with preliminary modeling because they also know that that's how better decisions are made. So, you know, look around, look for partners, but don't be afraid to ask for the kinds of analysis that ensures projects are better planned. And so anyway, Gillian, back to, you know, where we see practice headed, I have seen at least one instance where an architectural firm shifted and has brought on their staff, their own modeling services.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. So I see, Erin, you're still typing feverishly away. That's awesome. And again, John, we don't want to keep you. If you gotta go, you gotta go. With the question, Erin, about utility engagement, I remember that this had been brought up in the chat a little earlier. When some of the Class A or Class 1, as you said it, structures are kind of based on the assumption that it will be economically viable to be able to use some of these structures. And for example, maybe net metering is not very helpful in the state at this time. Do you have any responses to how to get that sort of procurement in a way which is economically successful for the investor?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hurdle if utilities are supporting net metering as much as you know I talked about in the framework and is pretty commonly accepted. On-site generation is the first best choice typically for multiple reasons, but one of the biggest incentives for on-site generation is that if you're generating more energy than you're consuming, you typically get to sell that back to the utility, and that's an economic benefit. And so if a utility is putting significant limits on that, the upfront costs of on-site solar are high, and that can be a potentially prohibitive barrier. It's certainly at least a barrier. So I guess I think the beauty of the Zero Code framework is that it really heavily emphasizes how to do procurement and not just generation. And as John talked about in his examples, we're seeing cases where there are not significant cost premiums for a lot of the other alternatives. And I suppose that just in a context where net metering is not allowed in a jurisdiction or there's limits on it, that kind of classification, like you mentioned, Jillian, of the different procurement options might change, and some of those might become more preferable than even on-site solar. I think it's important too, just kind of like from a bigger picture perspective, to remember that a lot of the reason we're talking about procurement at all is that a lot of buildings are literally unable to generate on site enough energy to meet their demand. And so if we aren't early on bringing offsite procurement into the equation, designers are going to be banging their heads against the wall trying to achieve zero carbon in impossible situations. And so really having a framework in place for supporting offsite procurement, making sure it's high quality, making sure it's affordable is a win for everybody in achieving this beyond utility-based barriers.
Thank you, Erin. That's a very good answer. So folks, we're going to be wrapping up the webinar. And as you'd seen earlier, both John and Erin have put their contact information in the chat. I guess for formality's sake, here's mine as well. The irony of what this whole series is going about how we're going to be able to help enable the built environment to achieve zero carbon. And so right now we have a lot of this education series, as Morgan has put in the chat. There is recordings from the previous ones we've done before. Now respond to the survey that Wendy has put out of what specific deep dives that you want to see more of. We've been getting a lot of great feedback through that survey about what we can incorporate to help you understand on what is impossible in the built environment before we enter the engagement stage of this project, and understanding from you what you want better buildings to look like in Grand Rapids and how you want to be able to be helped to achieve those. So thank you so much, John and Erin, for joining us today. It's honestly such a treat to have national experts talking with us in good old Grand Rapids, Michigan. And thank you everybody on the call for coming today. It's been awesome to have you. Today is my last day at the USGBC of West Michigan, and it's been a treat, an honor to be able to be with the USGBC for 4+ years and hosting this, sorry, Ben. Hosting the E.H.Zero project and getting the E.H.Zero project started in Michigan has been a real accomplishment that I'm proud of. And thank you everybody sorry guys. Just thank you for participating in this work, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it goes. So thank you. You have my email. I'll be sending emails today, and then after that I'm signing off. And find me on LinkedIn. Okay, everybody, have a great day. But in all honesty, take care, John and Erin, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Jillian, and you'll be missed. Not gone.
Thank you. It's going to be great.
Take care. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.